Okay, so in this video, I'm going to look at the Socratic method in practice, which will be an overview of the method and the ways in which it can be used. So for an introduction, just to look at a bit of background, who was Socrates? So he was an ancient Greek philosopher who lived roughly 400 BC, and he's considered to be the father of philosophy in the West at least. What we can know about him and his method is actually not too much explicitly because he never wrote a thing, and neither did anyone write anything about the Socratic method in terms of explicit rules and explicit principles, not until much later on. Because all we have are a set of dialogues that were originally written by a couple of pupils of Socrates, most notably Plato, and it's from those dialogues that we distill the key principles of the Socratic method. So Socrates never used the method as if he were following a set of rules. He just used what he knew to be the best way of engaging in dialogue, basically. So it's a very broad pool of knowledge from which this Socratic method comes from, a very broad set of principles that you see in these dialogues. And that's where I think it finds its strength, because the reason why the Socratic method is so important is because it's basically a filtering mechanism. It allows you to filter out inconsistent ideas but keep consistent ones. Because consistency is ultimately akin to the truth, because only consistent ideas are not contradictory with themselves, and only consistent ideas survive the testing of questions you throw at them. And so it's these inconsistent ones that must be false. That's why it's useful. It's a filtering mechanism to arrive ultimately at the truth. So in a nutshell, the Socratic method is the art of constructive dialogue. Construction, or the act of construction towards the truth in dialogue. But here's the caveat. You can also have a dialogue with yourself, because you don't have to talk, but you can have that dialogue in your mind. And so not only can you use this method with other people, but you can use it with yourself. And it's on that note that I'll say here that when I talk about the method in this video, I will primarily talk about it in the context of speaking with others. But everything I say in that context can also be said of when you're using it on yourself. So, resources. The main resource I used was this book. It's the Socratic Method, a Practitioner's Handbook, written by Ward Farnsworth. He is a professor of law at the University of Texas Law School. He's written a bunch of other books on law, English, rhetoric, and chess. I say this because, first of all, he is a professor of law, and I think that gives him a very unique perspective from which to describe this Socratic method in a way that's practical and frankly real, because in law, only in law, can you, or are you forced to use this method in a way that you can effectively refute other people's arguments, construct your own arguments, and ultimately win the case for your client, right? You're using this method in a fundamentally real context, and that gives him a certain edge that I don't think other professors of philosophy have. And so on that basis, I recommend his book very strongly. All the ideas I talk about in this video will be talked about in a bit more detail, if not a lot more detail, in his book. But also, I recommend his other books simply because the style in which he writes is very accessible and engaging. So that's also worth adding too. Right, so now on to the method itself. So first of all, I'm going to look at the outlook and attitudes the method requires, but also those attitudes that the method fosters. First of all, I mentioned that the method comes from a set of dialogues. So naturally, the method finds its home in dialogue, in a sequence of questions and answers. And it's this flow of dialogue we have to keep in mind when we're using the method, or have the right outlook on when we're using the method. So first of all, you want to be asking open-ended questions to seek the other's thoughts. You want to help them develop what they think, basically, so that you have an accurate representation of their ideas in your mind. And it's only from that accurate picture that you can then accurately test those ideas. Because the final stage is that you focus on closed and leading questions to test those principal ideas and concepts. But you can only do that if you have that accurate picture. So you can think of this process as making something like a clay pot with the other person, because the other person, through the answers they give, provides the clay. Your job is to mold that pot into the most accurate pot that represents their thoughts. And from that, you can then test the pot. In this analogy, you're seeing where it'll crack if you try and break it in different angles, right? So I think that's a useful analogy to have, because it hopefully emphasizes the fact that you're building this thing with the other person. And that's a really key aspect of dialogue, because you want to make sure you carry out the dialogue in a constructive way. That brings us on to some Socratic rules for the dialogue. Or just dialogue in general. You want to search for truth. You don't want to just try and win, because we all know how that looks like. It doesn't look good. It's very rarely pretty. And worst of all, you don't get anything from it. Only if you're searching for the truth can you have a constructive dialogue. If you're just trying to win, then that's not going to help anyone, because you're just shouting at the other person. You're not talking with them. Secondly, you want to aim for candor. You want to say what you think honestly and truthfully, and not just what will make you look good. This goes two ways. You want to avoid lying about whether you're wrong, and you also want to avoid withholding what you think is true. In both of these cases, you're essentially trying to avoid wanting to look good, because only if you want to look good will you avoid saying what you honestly think, in fear of it not looking good, basically. But also you will withhold the truth when it comes to an aspect where you know you are wrong, because you don't want to accept that you're wrong in case it makes you not look good. So aim for honesty and truth in what you say, and put your image basically in the back seat. That's the aim here. That's when you have an engaging dialogue. It's when you don't care how you look. You just aim for the truth and say what you think is true, even if it means you're wrong, and even if it means saying something that others might not want to hear. Lastly, you want to assume that the other person means well, and that person is intelligent. This is quite basic, but it's very easy to lose sight of when the dialogue might begin to get heated. By assuming that the other person means well, only then will you refrain from taking a defensive position. Because if you take a defensive position, then things can easily get heated. You might raise your voice, etc., etc. But you can only avoid that by assuming that the other person means well. In other words, assuming that they're not just trying to win. Second of all, you want to assume that they're intelligent, because only then will you be able to listen to what they have to say. Only then will you think that what they have to say is worth listening to. So with all of these rules in carrying out a dialogue, only then can you actually have a good dialogue. So hopefully these help, keeping in mind the flow of dialogue that you're also aiming for. Now, it's these rules that also take me onto the key principles of the method, because it's all good knowing what the flow of questions and answers should look like, and it's all good also knowing the way in which we should carry out the dialogue, but what are we aiming for? What is the goal? So I talked a bit about consistency. I talked a bit about the principle of consistency before, but really what it is the truth. The Socratic method shows you how the things you already think may be wrong, but it also shows you how your beliefs might turn against you. Because inconsistency happens when your existing principles contradict themselves. And if they contradict themselves, they can't be true. So the ultimate goal is consistency because the ultimate goal is truth. That is the aim of dialogue. That is the aim of this whole enterprise, this whole method. And you want to sift out all the ideas that are inconsistent. Second of all, we have the principle of ignorance. This principle is fundamental in attaining the right attitude when you use the method, because the conversation is supposed to begin with "I don't know." Otherwise, there's no point in the conversation. If you think you know, principally, if you think you know it all, there's no point in a conversation. So starting off with that ignorance is paramount. So what we want to avoid is double ignorance. Double ignorance is the worst thing. That's being unaware of your ignorance. When you're unaware of your ignorance, that's when you say, "I know it all." That's when you get a character of arrogance. So you want to avoid that. Because if you're wrong and you know it, you can account for it. And that's useful to us, because when you enter this new realm of knowledge that you know you don't know too much about, only then can you go into it cautiously and seeking new knowledge from others. The aim is also to try to not add to your knowledge before you know what you don't know. So in other words, you want to avoid making a top-heavy system of belief or principles. Because what happens when you do that, you keep building, building, and building without acknowledging your ignorance. In other words, without analyzing the layers below, then the layers below will basically become rusty. And so you're left with a top-heavy kind of structure. And when you test it, when you're forced to rely on it, it will collapse inevitably. So you want to avoid that. And ignorance is the only way in which you will constructively analyze all of those lower levels. And so we have a Greek word here called aporia, which is the final note on this principle. Aporia is the state of not knowing. And only from that state can we get a kind of constructive humility in being motivated to learn, because only from humility can we say, well, then I must learn, right? Only in humility do we get the notion of not knowing and seeking knowledge, because only in arrogance do we say, I have no need to learn. So keeping hold of this principle is extremely important in adopting the method in a way that actually improves your character, which I think is one of the fundamental uses of this method, maybe more so than using it with others, because it can instill in you the very character, almost the very virtue that leads to constructive dialogue. So that brings me on to the next thing. The tools. What can we actually use in dialogue in order to filter out inconsistent ideas? First of all, we have the idea of an elenchus. This is when you ask the other person whether they agree with a set of propositions or not, and then show that by agreeing to one of them, the original claim is contradicted. It becomes inconsistent or false. An example is within these original dialogues, we find a character called Laches and a character called Socrates, whom we know quite well by now, hopefully. And they talk about the virtue of bravery. Now, Socrates asks Laches, is bravery the idea of perseverance, essentially at all costs, right? Perseverance of the soul at all costs. And Laches says, you know what? I agree with that. Bravery seems to be perseverance essentially at all costs. And then Socrates says, okay, great, let's work with that. So what about in battle? When you retreat in battle, are there times where it's prudent to do so? In other words, can you supposedly abandon perseverance, but it's still prudent to do so? And then Laches is forced to agree. He says, Well, yeah, it's got to be prudent in some cases to retreat in battle, because there are times where it's imprudent to persevere in battle. And then Socrates can say, well, we have a bit of a contradiction here. Basically, you said perseverance was, sorry, you said bravery was the idea of perseverance essentially at all costs, but you're saying it's prudent and good to retreat in battle in some instances. If bravery is a virtue and prudence is a virtue, they cannot contradict each other. Therefore, the idea of bravery as simply just perseverance at all costs must be false, because it contradicts with the proposition of prudent retreat in battle, right? So hopefully that gives a bit of an idea of what the elenchus is. You provide a set of propositions and you then provide another one, toss another one in, which reveals the nature of the original claim. Okay, so the next tool we have, the final tool we have, is distinction between concepts. This is the idea of a systole and diastole, showing that two things are one or one thing is actually two. An example is if I said all pigeons run away from people in fear. If you live in central London, you can then say to me, well, that's just not true. Have you gone to central London? These pigeons are fearless. No matter what happens, they just continue eating whatever they're eating on the pavement. And I will say, yeah, that's perfectly true. So you've essentially given another principle or proposition to me, and in a way that's kind of like the elenchus that we just touched on. But here there's the added layer of the diastole, because we can then agree, rightfully so, that there are some pigeons that are like city pigeons, they're like fearless pigeons, strong pigeons. There are also weak pigeons, they're scared of everything, right? So we have these two kinds of pigeons. And in that way, we have a diastole. And in a similar way, we can have a systole where two ideas are actually one idea. They should be treated as one. These are the only tools that we have, really, the core tools of the method, the elenchus and the idea of broadening and collapsing. Or rather, sorry, I guess when you're broadening a concept, you're encapsulating them, right? You're collapsing more concepts into one. So it's more accurate to say the idea of splitting and collapsing seemingly separate concepts. And that's it. It's just these tools are the only probably complicated parts of the method. The rest is pretty much remembering to have the right approach, the right character, the right outlook, and the right attitude. So I think in that way this method is quite simple, and in that way it's quite neat. That takes me on to a couple of other aspects, the other aspects of using the method in everyday situations. First of all, on yourself. So the aim when you're using it on yourself is to scrutinize your own ideas. This is quite hard to do otherwise, so it's quite a nice framework. Step 1, admit your lack of knowledge. Step 2, find out the underlying principles that you hold by asking yourself questions. And step 3, using the methods of reason, which we just touched on, the tools of reason, process with examples those underlying principles and keep on doing that, filtering out those principles. And another thing I didn't actually mention is the use of examples, which I mentioned here, and that's just quite a global aspect of the method. It's very hard to suggest propositions and test them without examples, so it might not need mentioning, but it's worth mentioning, I think, at least here. And that is because only with examples can you get concrete representations of ideas, especially when you're asking about other people's ideas. It's very helpful to get them to talk or look at specific examples. And same applies here with yourself. Testing your principles that you or we really often hold on the basis of trust, testing them with examples is more or less the only way to actually think, hang on a minute, if I apply this principle in this situation in real life, it doesn't seem to match up, right? It's only with examples that we can get that. So I do want to stress the importance of examples. So hopefully with this, you can kind of see how the Socratic method can be used on yourself to scrutinize your own ideas and reach consistent ideas by filtering out those inconsistent ones. When it comes to working with others, I think the attitude that the Socratic method fosters is very helpful. First of all, the assumption that you don't know it all. I mean, no one wants to work with someone who's arrogant, right? And the way you can avoid being arrogant is assuming you don't know it all. That's a really good way to step into a team, because then you will value what other people say. And that goes in tandem with assuming that others know more than you to begin with, because then you will be able to listen to them far more attentively, and they will be most likely happy to talk with you if you are attentive to them, right? So it builds a team. Thirdly, it helps to admit any lack of knowledge. This is slightly different. This is you saying, if you're asked about something, hang on a minute, I actually don't know that. But doing it in a constructive way, because if someone comes to you for help and you say, I don't know, they're not going to be very happy with that if you just leave it at that. So to make it constructive, try and give a pointer where they might be able to find the answer, another person, or maybe a bit of knowledge that you do know, but acknowledging or admitting that you don't know any more than that. Lastly, but quite similarly, you don't want to lie. You just want to be as honest as possible. Only in this way, naturally, can you work well with others. And this principle is fundamental to the Socratic method, because you're ultimately looking for the truth. So it's completely contradictory to try and lie in the Socratic method. So in a similar way, it always helps to be honest. And I understand in many contexts, especially in work, you don't want to give all the information, but you can limit the information you give and focus on a bit of information is okay to disclose. But the ultimate thing here is to be honest and don't lie. Next, you can use the Socratic method when you work with tasks and solutions. So first of all, you can make the proper distinctions between tasks in the same way you can make the proper distinctions using the principles or tools of the systole and diastole. In the same way, you can say that maybe all of the tasks you are given is just one task, a meta task, or maybe one big task you're given is actually several loads of smaller ones, right? So you're splitting these concepts, making these distinctions. The next area you can use the Socratic method is in the principle of finding the best solution, because the best solution is ultimately the one that is most consistent. And that sounds very similar to our method, right? The solution, we get is the one that does not contradict itself. In other words, does not cause any other problems or the problem it's actually trying to solve, but also it is the one that survives all the problems or aspects of the problem that are put forward. And so really, when you're especially working in a field like engineering, the solution you are developing is kind of like the consistent idea you're trying to find in dialogue. So I think that's a really neat parallel, because you can treat your work ideally as a kind of dialogue. You're nurturing this idea, filtering this idea through this process. And I think I think it works. I think it works, right? I don't think I've fleshed this idea out as much as I could, but I think it helps to keep in mind that there are similarities with the Socratic method and the idea of building solutions in general. And that it sounds quite nice, frankly. So with that, I've gone through the attitudes that are required in the method and the attitudes that are required or fostered by it, the principles that are held or need to be held to use the method effectively, and the reasons or the reasoning tools that you have to use in order to effectively apply the method. And that's all there is really to it. I mean, that's it. That's it. So it's quite small. It's quite small. So I hope you've taken away something that can be used, anything that you might be able to use in your everyday life or in your work, wherever, in a way that you can constructively arrive at consistent ideas. In other words, in a way that you can constructively arrive at the truth with others. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that was interesting.